the newsagents.
There is turmoil in Parliament over immigration. There is a ministerial resignation over immigration. The leader of a party pulled from pillar to post and being accused of giving in to the hard right, bringing in the most draconian set of immigration reforms that the country has ever seen.
But this is not Westminster. This is the other side of the English Channel. This is France and the Assemblée Nationale, where Macron's government is tearing itself to pieces over this legislation, which Marine Le Pen, the leader of the Front National is describing as an ideological victory for the right. And this just isn't happening in France, it's happening across Europe. And indeed, if you look at some of the rhetoric around immigration, it's happening in America too. Welcome to the Newsagents. It's John.
It's Lewis.
And a little bit later on, we will talk about something to do with British politics and a new installation in Downing Street, which you will not want to miss.
Should I tell them what you said it might be earlier?
No.
Okay, all right.
No, don't get me into trouble. Don't get me into trouble.
John said something very rude. We're not going to go there. No, I know. It is Christmas. It is Christmas. We should talk about France because it is easy in British politics. We've obviously, basically since September, we've been so, on this show, British politics generally has been sort of convulsed by the Rwanda plan. It's shaken Rishi Sunak's government, and it can be so easy to get lost in the sort of conservative psychodrama. But it is fair to say that exactly these same questions, which are being deeply contested around immigration, around how to deal with asylum, refugee numbers, which are growing in salience across electorates throughout Europe, is happening elsewhere as well. And we should put it in that context. And the most recent example of this, as we were saying at the top there, is with France and President Macron. French government facing a profound political crisis following the introduction of these reforms. Basically, long story short, Macron was introducing some immigration reform, partly because he was trying to see off this threat of the far right, Marine Le Pen, her party, the National Rally. They lost control of the bill in Parliament. And in order to try and get any vote through, he basically had to accept a series of pretty hardline amendments, which Marine Le Pen has now given her assent to, and Macron is now being accused of giving in to the far right on immigration reform, and he's had his minister, the health minister, Aurélien Rousseau, offer his resignation as a result.
Yeah, if you just look at the measures, and it kind of still feels eerily familiar to an awful lot of what Rishi Sunak as well has been proposing, and what Suella Braverman was calling for when she was Home Secretary. So reduced access to welfare benefits for foreigners, migration quotas, tougher rules for foreign students, making it harder for children of non-nationals born in France to become citizens. And there, as you say, Lewis, there have been scores of people within Macron's own grouping who are saying, this is just ridiculous, what are we doing? And you've also got people on the left saying, these are the most hardline measures that France has ever introduced, these are the most sweeping reforms of the Fifth Republic, and they must be challenged. But Macron feels that if he doesn't do this, he is setting the stage for a victory of the hard right. And there are people in France saying, look, this goes further than Giorgia Meloni was proposing in Italy.
So again, just as we see in Britain, the fissures that are being caused, that are being generated by this question of migration and how to deal with it, are running really deeply through basically centre-right groupings, which is what Macron's group is, across Europe. And Macron, and to some extent Sunak, although I think Sunak by instinct is more hardline on this stuff, and other leaders across Europe are facing exactly the same question, right? What do you do? Do you try and stem the rise of far right or hard right groups by moving onto their turf and offering electorates something which they say that they want or that they think that they want? Or by doing that, do you risk just aping their language, aping their rhetoric and giving them legitimacy? I mean, one MP has accused Macron of basically Le Pen giving him the kiss of death, that's what they've called it, in terms of what they've done. And the idea behind that is to basically say, you are moving in Le Pen's direction. And in so doing, electorates basically say, and we were exploring this on the Special Investigates episode we did in the Netherlands at the weekend, which people, of course, can listen to. Basically, they are saying the danger is that electorates essentially turn around and go, well, if you're basically doing what they're saying. How can they be extreme? They can't be extreme because you're moving in their direction, and that's the quandary that leaders are having to kind of grapple with.
And the other quandary in all of that is, if that's what you're sort of proposing, why don't I go for the real thing?
Yeah, exactly.
Why don't I
Full
go
fat.
for the real thing, the full fat version of it? And you can see that in Conservative politics here in Britain, where year after year, politician after politician has promised that they're going to tackle net migration figures and they're going to do this and they're going to bring it down. And each year it goes up and up and up. And then you suddenly see the Reform Party or whoever on the right saying, well, if you really want to get this done, you come to us because we're serious about it and we will tackle it. Now, it's a simplification of the problems that a country faces where you still need foreign workers to come in. But the appeal is there by doing it. But then the risk, conversely, is if you don't talk about it and don't accept that people have legitimate concerns about the levels of immigration in their area where maybe there has been a big influx of migrants and suddenly schools and social services and housing are under pressure because of it, then the danger is you are tone deaf to the concerns of your electorate. The other alternative is you go to where Donald Trump has gone in America, and that is to use language, which I'm going to use the word advisedly, is fascistic, talking about immigrants being vermin, talking about them poisoning the blood. I mean, it's not an Aryan race, America, but language like that has very Hitlerian overtones at the very least.
Well, we're joined now by Peter Allen, who's LBC's Paris correspondent. Peter, thanks so much for coming on the show. Macron has found himself in a really deep hole politically on this one, hasn't he?
He has had to rely on the far right, the Rassemblement National, to push through his latest immigration package. There was a heated debate in the National Assembly a couple of nights ago. He had Rassemblement National supporting this package, while members of his own party, Renaissance, voted against it or abstained. He's now being accused of governing with the far right and, of course, potentially enabling them to win the presidential election in 2027.
I suppose his counter-argument, Peter, would be that, look, if I don't make moves in this direction, then Marine Le Pen is going to be unchallenged. And if we can, if I can place my party to be on the sort of centre-right of French politics and meeting people's concern about immigration, that will stop them going to Marine Le Pen.
He's very clever at talking a good game, sort of saying that he's not actually supporting the far right, when in fact he is actually working with the far right. So I think you're right. I think that's what he will be saying, and indeed is saying.
Isn't one of the things that's gone on, Peter, in France, and we've seen this elsewhere in Europe as well, we saw it with Het Wilders in the Netherlands recently and elsewhere, is that the forces of the traditional far right have repackaged themselves. I mean, Marine Le Pen has substantially repackaged herself. She's a very different figure to her father, who I think, was much closer to the sort of traditional embodiment of the far right. The far right are effectively, maybe not, they're not changing necessarily their core beliefs, but they're changing their emphasis, they're changing the way they're talking about politics. They're trying to present an image of themselves which is more moderate. So politics is kind of moving to them, and they are to some extent moving a little bit to where the traditional, not the centre was, but not as extreme as they were historically.
Well, that's what they claim, and that is certainly what Marine Le Pen has always said. She says she banishes her father. Do we really believe that? She said at the last presidential election that if she did win, the first person inside the Élysée with her to congratulate her and to spend time with her would be Jean-Marie Le Pen, a convicted racist, a convicted anti-Semite. Has the leopard changed its spots? Plenty of people in France don't think it has. It doesn't just want to be a protest party, screaming and shouting out on the pavement. It wants to be inside the Élysée Palace. So, of course, Marine Le Pen has played the game and said that everything has changed and she's now an acceptable face of right-wing conservatism.
Peter, when I lived in Paris, admittedly 20 plus years ago, and was there when Jean-Marie Le Pen beat Jospin and got himself into the second round of the French presidential election against Chirac, I was always struck by how more openly racist France was as a country compared to the UK. You know, you'd get in a taxi and people would tell you straight away that they didn't like blacks or they didn't like the Arabs or whatever it happened to be. And I just wonder whether you think, on reflection, it is a more racist society than Britain, or whether in Britain we kind of hide it a lot more.
I've lived in a very mixed area of Paris, and you openly hear intensely racist language. Now, that's sort of day-to-day racism you hear all the time. You go to the fabled dinner parties, which everybody is meant to go to all the time in Paris, and you hear extremely respectable people coming out with the most shocking racist comments, and they expect you to agree with them, and they talk in these kind of terms. The kind of language, the kind of vernacular that I kind of remember in Britain maybe 20, 30 years ago. French society hasn't moved on in the way British society has, and this assists far-right parties such as the Rassemblement National.
Isn't part of the story here, though, as well, is that where is the left? I mean, the French left has been, and certainly the traditional French Socialist Party is basically nowhere now. There is this sort of new grouping where they all try and come together. But much of French politics, like quite a bit of European politics in different countries now, is basically conducted on a stage with different shades of right.
One-word answer to that, really, Lewis. Divided. That's what the left are now. Divided, divided, divided. If they came together and Jean-Luc Mélenchon started to work with the socialists, for example, and the communists, they would easily deliver a president and they would have a very large majority in the National Assembly. But they don't. They're just massively divided. We had a socialist government relatively recently and a socialist president, and François Hollande. He wasn't particularly impressive. He was seen as being too mainstream by a lot of the French and the French left. So that's really the problem. They're just extremely divided at the moment.
Peter, thank you so much for joining us.
Peter, that was great. Thank you so much.
Not at all. Thanks ever so much. Great.
I think all that, John, is so important in terms of what we said at the very beginning, which is the sort of context around which this is completely shaping and shaking this immigration issue, European politics right now, even though actually the numbers overall are way down on where they were in, say, 2015-16. But there is this perception of kind of fortress Europe being constantly penetrated, what's happened in the Mediterranean and so on. We've seen how that shaped Italian politics. But if you just look across the continent, you've got the AfD, really, really extreme. I mean, in Germany, of all places, which is where, you know, the cordon sanitaire, the iron wall between the far right and the rest of politics, is if it's been strongest anywhere, it's been in Germany for obvious historic reasons. AfD are now on the rise. They've just won their first mayoralty. They're polling well, particularly as the incumbent sort of centre-left government is doing badly. Meloni is there in Italy. Austria's far-right Freedom Party is on the rise. We've seen what's happened in Sweden with the Swedish Democrats, the Netherlands as well, with Wilders. This is reshaping European politics, and the people who are really worried about it are in Brussels, because there are European elections next May. There is a widespread expectation in this kind of radical right, populist right, far right forces, whatever you want to call them, and they're slightly different things in different places, are going to really do very well in those elections. Most of them are Eurosceptic, and it has very significant repercussions potentially for the way the European project is conducted and European integration, which has been basically a one-way street for many decades.
And if you look at European politics in terms of the European Parliament or whatever, it has always been that there was the powerful centre-right bloc, there was the powerful centre-left bloc, and those were the two kind of axes of the European Parliament. And that is going to change fundamentally now with the hard right, where, you know, people who were on the scene to be I mean, you remember when David Cameron took the Conservatives out of the European People's Party, which is the main centre-right grouping, which was where Angela Merkel's party was, and sort of was suddenly teaming up with kind of people who were seen to be absolutely at the fringes of European politics, and the criticism there was of Cameron for doing that, which was done for domestic reasons and for domestic consumption. But now they're not going to be so fringe anymore, these people.
And how long before you end up with a hard right commissioner being sent to Brussels, for example? That would shake things up there. They would never have had any experience of that. Typically, they have had, you know, centre-left, centre-right politicians, like you say,
Eurocrats.
who are broadly aligned on kind of what Europe should look like and what it should be like. It's not totally inconceivable. You could have a Nigel Farage type figure, not just kind of, you know, sounding off in the European Parliament, but being sent to Brussels to run something. And that would be something completely novel within the European context.
Well, let's speak now to Nabila Ramdani, journalist, writer, who wrote the brilliant book Fixing France, which is a really great read about the problems that France faces today. And you were on the Newsagents podcast a little while ago when there was unrest in the banlieue. It's great to have you back with us today. I wonder what you make of what Macron is doing and why.
Well, I think there is a great irony, and dare I say, a grim irony in what Macron is doing, because Macron effectively came in as, or presented himself as a bulwark against the National Rally. But his position has actually changed radically. And as we saw this week, he's now effectively relying on National Rally votes in Parliament. And even some of his own ministers are accusing him of governing with the National Rally. So there is no doubt that he's shifted to the right massively. And many are saying that he's now the enabler who will ensure a Le Pen president in 2027.
What do you make of the argument that I know Macron has posited, and I suppose his supporters would say, which is that he's doing this precisely to try and fend off the prospect of a National Rally presidency and that, or a far-right presidency, and that he's got to be seen to do something to counter the electorate's concerns around immigration, asylum, integration, and so on?
Well, I think there's a lot of clear reasons why extremist parties and why more mainstream ones, more central ones, more liberal ones like Macron's Renaissance Party are taking such a stance on issues such as immigration, which is always going to be a controversial and contentious issue, because it's such a prominent matter across Europe at the moment. The cost of living crisis and the general feeling of impoverishment has made people feel pretty desperate, and they are looking for radical solutions. And I think Macron thinks he's offering that kind of solutions. And let's be honest, immigration has also become a huge media issue in very recent years, in a way it was never before. You even have myths and indeed conspiracy theories surrounding immigration, which are widely widespread. For example, some believe that immigrant communities will soon replace indigenous ones, and these are the kind of effectively ridiculous tropes that increase the far-right vote, and Macron is clearly tapping into that kind of extreme votes. But dare I say, I think France's problem is that it doesn't have sufficient mechanism to control the extremes. If you look at a country like Germany, for example, it works coalitions very well. The UK, for example, very successfully keeps extremists out of parliament. And you certainly wouldn't get 80 members of parliament or so from the far right in the House of Commons, as is the case in Paris now. So I think the very dangerous French presidential system allows a single individual like Marine Le Pen to take charge of the entire system with very few democratic checks and balances. And that's proven the case this week in Parliament. And Le Pen certainly thinks she can successfully play this system well enough to enter the Elysée in 2027.
Nabila, do you buy the new, softer focused, kinder, gentler, more compromising Marine Le Pen that she is trying to present to the French people?
No, I don't buy it for a second. I think she's very much a chip of the old bloc. Her messages is very straightforward and largely unchanged from the really ugly days of the National Front. And there are too many immigrants essentially in France, and that strict controls are needed. What has changed, however, I think, is the public mood. Xenophobia has gone mainstream, and far more French people think it is perfectly permissible to use discourse that discriminates against foreigners. And racism is on the rise, along with deep prejudice against religious minorities. I think what Marine Le Pen has tried to do with her national rally is try to turn it from a former one single issue of the National Front, meaning that its message was all about immigration, and immigration, But she clearly wants to widen her policy interests because she wants to be president of France, and she now has views about everything, including very parochial ones about the economy, such as making sure that 80% of food in school dinners is sourced in France, for example, which is a bit wet as far as economic policies are concerned.
And just on the specifics of what Macron is proposing about the limitations on migrants, about welfare benefits, about citizenship and all the rest of it. I just wonder what it means to you personally with North African heritage, but French. How does it make you feel?
Well, one of the aims of the new legislation is to introduce tough new measures, including quotas for immigrants and stricter conditions for residency permits. And that would mean stopping families like mine, for example, from bringing family members to France, from Algeria in my case. And that's often the nature of migration, to bring families together. There are also proposed clampdowns on getting health and other types of social security provisions and effectively introducing a system of so-called national preference. Now, members of my family originally came over from Algeria to help rebuild French infrastructure, which by the 1970s and the 1980s were still in a very bad way following the horrific bombing during the Second World War. And now that would mean that immigrant construction workers, of which there are always many, are being threatened with deportation because it will become a lot harder for them to get permits to reside in France, let alone gain citizenship. In very practical terms, if I was born under this new legislation that's coming through in this package, I would certainly be discriminated against, meaning that if I was born to immigrant parents on French soil, I would not automatically become French. Now, my father was brought to help rebuild the country, so it seems extremely unfair that his own children would now be threatened with deportation. And I think, France is built on immigration in the end. It has a huge amount of land borders, and it also created a vast colonial power across the world for centuries, so increasing the number of immigrants.
And just finally, in terms of, could you just sum up how kind of France feels at the moment in terms of the kind of atmosphere of politics, the kind of pitch and tenor of politics, and how you're feeling about the years ahead? I mean, the next presidential election obviously is still some way away in 2027, but it certainly feels like could potentially be an extremely important one.
Yes, indeed, and I think this immigration legislation sums it up really, because it's a law that represents a blow to France's tradition of a land built on immigration. Far from building a cohesive society, this immigration law sums up France's rejection of differences, and it instead festers bigotry, suspicion, and indeed extremism. It effectively stigmatizes and it defies the huge contribution extremely hard-working immigrants have made in key sectors. So it's essentially a bill that's grounded in the small town prejudices of Marine Le Pen's Rassemblement National and not in France's ideological commitment to human rights.
Nabila, it's great to have you with us again. Thank you so much. Enjoy the holidays and meilleurs vœux pour la nouvelle année.
Merci infiniment to both of you.
Okay.
Bonne année.
Bye.
And see you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
So just two things that I was just thinking about there, and what in terms of what Nabila was saying and what Peter was saying as well, which is that I mean, we made a whole show about it on Newsagents. I mean, I am concerned about the drift towards far-right rhetoric, towards the strengthening of far-right parties. The example you just mentioned, John, about Trump, America is always slightly further ahead of us. What he said was chilling to the blood and to the bone. I mean, it really was. And it sort of shows the extent to which we are the frogs in the boiling water, that we're not more shocked by this stuff now, that you could have a presidential candidate basically invoking that sort of rhetoric of fire and fury, very pure far right and so on. I would say, though, that, you know what, the centre-left and liberal forces and centrism more generally, it does have to have something to offer and to say to electorates that not just addresses their concerns, which is the kind of cliche, but also which shows that the centre has something to offer. I mean, one of the reasons that we're in this situation is because, and Nabila, to be fair to her, did just allude to it, we have had this series of profound economic crises, which has culminated in the cost of living crisis. And very often, the centre of politics, centre left, centre right, can seem exhausted intellectually, politically, and that it has little to say. And in that case, don't be surprised if electorates find themselves being gravitated towards people who, whatever you think of them, do have something to say. And that is just a challenge for 2024 in terms of how more centrist political forces or more traditional political forces approach politics and try and stem the flow of power towards these extremist forces.
I've always been struck by, when it comes to the debate, particularly about immigration, it's almost like, oh, this is rather uncomfortable. I don't really want to talk about this. And so you get mainstream politicians from the centre left and from the centre right sort of ducking the issue because they don't want to be branded as racist, they don't want to be stirring the pot, they don't want to upset the apple cart, whatever reason. But at a time when you have people on the right who want to make hay with this as an issue, for the centrist politicians to ignore it is a fatal mistake, and not to have a story to tell about the contribution, as we were hearing there from Nabila. You know, her father was brought over from Algeria to help rebuild France after the ravages of the Second World War. You know, the people that came into Britain because we needed to, you know, to run the health service, and we didn't have enough people to do it. There was a reason why patterns of migration happen.
And we're in a situation akin, not a million miles away from that now, in the sense that we do have ageing populations, we've got a post-COVID crisis, and we do have huge labour shortages across Western Europe. And I think you're right. Basically, there has got to be, you know, more centrist mainstream politicians have to find a way of articulating and addressing some of those concerns, whilst at the same time finding a different register and different story to tell about immigration and migration. Because, of course, if they do leave it entirely to the far right, then their tropes and their ideas are the ones that disseminate into mainstream politics. It is a really delicate balancing act. Not to ape them, but to find your own way and language of addressing the issue and telling a different story. It's a challenge, but then again, why are they in politics if they don't want to challenge?
We'll be back after the break. When I was a student, I shared the house I lived in with a medic.
Oh, here we go. Some Sopel student stories.
Finally. This is going to be highly sanitised version of student stories of Sopel. I was sharing with a medic, and I was just struck by how hard they worked. And of course, their course is not a 3-year undergraduate course, it's 5 years. And the joy at the end, where they graduate and they declare the Hippocratic Oath, and they are then young doctors. Except that it seems our new health secretary, Victoria Atkins, doesn't really think of them as qualified doctors. This is her on Breakfast TV this morning.
We have managed, through hard work and through compromise, to find an offer that I hope will be accepted by consultants. And we've managed to find a fair and reasonable settlement for specialty doctors as well. The last cohort is that of junior doctors, or doctors in training, as I prefer to call them.
Doctors in training.
I mean, the thing is about that is that, like, it's just sort of, more than anything else, it's just factually wrong, right? In the sense that, you know, like junior doctors, they can be like 40. I mean, I suspect it's just a kind of, you know, just a bit of a verbal slip. I can't imagine what the sort of strategy would be behind that. Probably just a sort of pre-Christmas verbal slip from the health
But she
secretary.
did say, I prefer to call them.
I know. I always think when politicians say, as I call them, it's always a bad sign. It's usually a sign it's totally made up. I remember when Nick Clegg used to say, you know, I'm all about people who get up early in the morning, people who I call Alarm Clock Britain. Who's that? No one else calls it, Nick. No one else says that. But yeah, it's a mistake in the sense that it's already being sort of pilloried. It's already being used against. So Wes Streeting has already tweeted out saying, you know, or as I call them, doctors, which is, you know, perfectly smart when he's having some difficulties with the NHS himself. But I mean, I think that there's a sort of wider thing with her, and which is not really about her, but about Sunak's approach, which I just cannot understand, which is, if I were Sunak, or if I were advising Sunak, and I was sat in number 10 right now, I'd be thinking, okay, like how can we give ourselves the best possible chance for 2024 so far behind, but what can we do to just make sure that we have the best fist of it possible? The one thing that I would say is, for God's sake, make a deal with all the strikers, particularly the doctors. Just make a deal, because we do not want to be starting 2024 with more strikes at a time when we've already got 7 million or so on the waiting list. At least we can show some progress. And quite frankly, and okay, it's very political and maybe it's a bit underhand in a sense, but I would do it if I were them. You know what? Chances are, in terms of the money situation, it's going to be Labour's problem to deal with anyway. So sign the cheque, end the strikes, deal with it, and at least put yourself in a position where you are giving yourself the best position to eke out a win in 2024.
Exactly, because historically, the Conservatives and the health service is not a vote-winning area for them. Labour are always seen as the stronger party on the health service. And so what you want to do is you want to neutralise it as an issue. And I kind of thought that when Victoria Atkins came in, that would be exactly
Totally.
Settle as fast as you can. Don't do any kind of shiny, controversial new reforms that are just going to cause a firestorm. Just reduce waiting lists where you can.
Yeah.
Make sure there are no queues of ambulances trying to drop people off, ER or whatever. And you
End it.
Calm it, cool it. Let's lower the temperature, both of the patient and of the health service, and so that you can go in with that as not being one of the fires that you're having to extinguish in the general election campaign.
I think it's another one of those examples where the Conservative Party has become haunted by the ghost of Margaret Thatcher, in a sense that Conservative leaders now think and believe that in order to show and exhibit their virility as Conservative Party leaders, they just have to constantly be seen to be having a fight with unions, whatever union it happens to be. The problem with that is twofold. First of all, okay, have a fight with the unions by all means. The problem is fighting the doctors and the nurses of all the unions is difficult, because basically the public have sympathy with them and they don't have sympathy with you, whatever actually the merits of your case or otherwise. And secondly, again, as ever, it's just a sort of two-dimensional ersatz reading of the Thatcher years. How many times did Thatcher make deals before she actually got herself into a position before she fought the unions? Loads of times. She didn't fight the unions in her first term. She didn't take the miners on in her first term. She waited. She waited until she was in strategically the right place to be able to take on Scargill and the rest of the unions, and so she could win. And she did that because she was clever and thought about the politics. She knew that she had to win elections in order, when she was running in 79, she wasn't talking aggressively, she wasn't talking the language that she would go on to talk. She knew she had to win elections in order to have the fight. Sometimes with this lot, it's as if they just think they want to have the fight and that will win them the elections. It's often the other way around.
I remember when Ken Clarke was Health Secretary and he was trying to introduce some reforms or kind of a new contract. And I think it was the BMA who put up an advertising campaign, and the BMA is the sort of doctors' union, if you like, with the title, "What do you call someone who doesn't listen to medical advice?" Answer, the health secretary.
That's very good.
And it was good, and it was effective piece of communication, because of course, you do listen to doctors and you do want to believe their advice, and they're not the National Union of Mine Workers as was. It's not Arthur Scargill, and to try and portray them as that. And everybody knows that junior doctors in training, work incredibly long hours, and it's pretty damn brutal when you have graduated and you are a junior house officer or whatever it happens to be doing your hospital stint, and the hours you're working are long and arduous and tough. And so to pick a fight there just seems to me wrong target. There is a very famous staircase in number 10 Downing Street where hang the portraits of the great prime ministers of our age. Churchill, Wilson, Thatcher, Blair, and now a couple of additions.
Yet today, we're told that the great shuffling has taken place, the real reshuffle that matters in Downing Street, when an official set of portraits are added to the very top of the staircase, and all the others are just nudged down, all the way back to Walpole, nudged down bit by bit. Bye-bye, Marquis of Rockingham. Bye-bye, Viscount Melbourne. William Lamb, down you go. Spencer Perceval, eat your heart out, because who is in town? Boris Johnson's portrait, but also one Mary Elizabeth Truss. Every time Rishi Sunak pops to the loo, she's going to go up there and see Liz Truss gurning gurning back at him at the very top of the staircase. Merry Christmas. And it's going to be great, right, as well, because, because it has the dates on as well, right? So it'll be like, Margaret Thatcher, 1979 to 1990, John Major, 1990, 97, Blair, 97, 2007, and it just gradually, Cameron, 2010, 16, May, 16, 19, Johnson, 1922,
Liz Truss
22.
Liz Truss, 49 days.
49 days. Oh, it's cheap, but it's still funny.
Makes us laugh. Anyway, it's our last show of the year.
Together.
We
have got one more show.
Oh, is there?
Yeah. No, I know.
It's the last show.
3 next week as well.
But this is the last show before Christmas when we're in the studio together.
That's true.
So what else would we do at this festive time but
have a tiny cracker?
We're
pulling our own crackers.
Yep.
What? Right, we were going to pull our own crackers, not for the first time, but the team have told us that looks too mad on camera, so we're going to pull each other's cracker for the first time. Oh, I win.
I lost.
Yeah.
It wasn't much of a bang, was there?
No. Well, what do you expect? It's about 15 centimetres long. What do you expect?
Well, they could have put Semtex in there. That would have made a bit of a bang.
No, that's Emily's one. Right, here we go. We've got a joke here.
Come on, there must be a joke.
There's a joke. Right, here we go. Why could the sailors not play cards?
Because they were underwater. No, they were... I can't... I'm just trying to think
Peter
of something.
K over here. Because the captain was standing on the deck. There you go. There you go.
Get your hat
I'm going to
on.
put the little hat on. It'll be too small for me. My head's massive. It's
Well,
been pointed
really?
out. Yeah.
We'd never seen
Massive
that.
brain,
have we?
of course.
We'd never got that before.
The Goodall knowledge bump, my dad calls it. Leave you with that.
Leave you with that and a very Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas, John.
Merry Christmas to you, Lewis.
Ho, ho, ho.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.